Video game development, like most creative endeavors, are pretty interesting beasts. There's often a lot of back and forth on what to implement, ideas get kicked around, and inevitably, some get left on the cutting room floor. I've always found fighting games in particular to have some of the most interesting cut and or scrapped content, and especially crossover fighters at that, because it's interesting to see how developers tend to deliberate on content choices for the game, and inevitably, the train of thought that leads to them being scrapped instead of implemented. The Capcom vs. games are no different than any other series in this regard. Unfortunately, the people involved with the series in the past have been pretty candid about some of the ideas tossed around that never came to fruition. So, without further ado, here's a few interesting things cut from the Capcom vs. games during development. Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, at least relative to the vs. games directly before and after it, always seemed like something of a black sheep of the series. The game features enough asset reuse to make Marvel 2 and Marvel Infinite blush. The only newly drawn character for the game was something of a joke inclusion that never made it out of the Japanese release of the game, and the final boss is essentially a Mugen edit of Akuma before Mugen was a thing. An admittedly cool edit, but a blatant one all the same. It's still an incredibly fun game just by virtue of its fighting engine, but playing and comparing it to X-Men vs. Street Fighter and Marvel vs. Capcom 1, it feels like this game was put together on a tighter budget and a shorter time frame than the aforementioned games. One area of the game in particular that's notable in these regards are its secret characters. There's a handful of hidden characters in the game that can be freely selected by the player, though most of them are palette swaps with not many, if any, tangible differences. One such example is Armored Spider-Man, a grayscale palette swap of Spider-Man based on the Spider Armor Mark I that appeared in issue 100 of Web of Spider-Man. In Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, using this variant of Spidey gave him one hit of super armor, as well as a slightly lower jump height. However, the initial proposed plan for an alternate Spider-Man was a little more ambitious. According to a tweet thread from former Capcom artist Katsuya Akitomo, the man largely credited for familiarizing 90s era Capcom with Marvel comics by translating them into Japanese, it was initially proposed that Spider-Man have a playable symbiote variant in the game. However, this was shot down because of the amount of work it would have taken to properly redraw all of his sprites, citing that those kinds of efforts were far harder to pull off in 2D than they were in 3D, where it's comparatively easier to reskin a model and reuse animations when necessary. This also explains why the vast majority of secret characters in the game are also palette swaps. Akitomo also mentioned US Agent as another character who ended up as a palette swap, since including a comic-accurate outfit would have required a bunch of redrawn pixel art. It does bear mentioning that in the very next game in the series, we got Venom added as a playable character, so they at least got to add some kind of symbiote to the series, and I'd argue that the Spider Armor's appearance in Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter is one of the more notable appearances of that suit outside of the comics, outside of, say, Marvel's Spider-Man game for PS4 and PS5. All's well that ends well, I suppose. Speaking of Marvel vs. Capcom 1, one of the game's biggest defining features is its special partner mechanic. After selecting your two playable characters, you can also select an additional Marvel or Capcom character to summon for a quick attack a finite number of times during a match. These characters ranged from people previously playable in the series like Storm, Rogue, and Shadow Charlie, to more obscure picks, at least for the time, like Saki, Thor, and Piran Fur. The Capcom assists in particular seem to primarily celebrate their arcade output in particular, with games like 3 Wonders, Forgotten Worlds, and Legendary Wings being represented through assists. And interestingly enough, there were 2 more characters originally planned to appear as well. This was revealed in the secret file released for the game back at release. Secret files were essentially small booklets that Capcom would release alongside their arcade games, with exclusive artwork and usually full of interviews and trivia directly from the development team. They ran until about 1999, though Capcom did revive the series to issue 2 special volumes, one in January 2010 and one specifically for the release of Street Fighter V Champion Edition. We'll be touching on one of them a bit later on. In Secret File 18, made specifically for Marvel vs. Capcom, the game's lead designer and planner, Atsushi Tomita, revealed that he initially wanted to include 2 additional assist characters, the first being LANCELOT from Capcom's Knights of the Round. This was a beat 'em up based on the well-known Arthurian legend. It has a unique level up system and a tricky but rewarding parry mechanic. The other character that was planned was Ravel, the elf character from the King of Dragons. King of Dragons was a beat 'em up based on a proposal for a Dungeons & Dragons beat 'em up that wouldn't come to fruition until after this game's release. Interestingly enough, Ravel actually made it to the concept art stage, with it being displayed in the secret file itself. As for why neither character made the cut, according to the man himself, it came down to Tomita not wanting to fill the game up with his own personal desires. Tomita is the staffer credited for pushing to get Strider in the game, and likely Tanpu as an assist as well, so his sentiments on the matter make more sense with that in mind. It does bear mentioning that the count for the assist characters that did make it into the final game is skewed in favor of Marvel, with them having, wait for it, 2 extra characters over the Capcom side. If they had made the cut, the assist roster would have actually been evenly balanced. When looking at the Versus series as a whole, one of the most interesting, and in my opinion one of the best character inclusions, was Phoenix Wright in Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. As a massive fan of the Ace Attorney series myself, it was a dream to see him bumbling around gathering evidence and staging a turnabout in mostly the same fashion he does in his own series. Phoenix's relationship with the Versus games actually goes a little further back though, to the Versus games directly preceding it, Tatsunoko vs. Capcom. Remember the secret files I mentioned earlier and how they were briefly resurrected in January of 2010? Well, that was for the release of Tatsunoko vs. Capcom Ultimate All-Stars. The secret file revealed a lot of content initially planned for the game on top of concept sketches, character models, and even some in-game pictures of some of the planned content. Phoenix himself was the standout here, with some art being displayed for him as well as some concept designs for a potential moveset. He was left out largely because the development team couldn't figure out a way, at least at the time, to implement him properly. However, it doesn't end there. Before the release of the secret file, the game's producer, Ryota Nitsuma, also spoke about Phoenix in an interview the year prior, and revealed that Phoenix was actually one of 2 Ace Attorney characters considered for the game. Well, who was the other one? FRANZISKA von Karma, the main prosecutor of the second Ace Attorney game, Justice for All. At Nitsuma's admittance, he mentioned that FRANZISKA would have been an easy character to implement. FRANZISKA's trademark is her whip, which she uses very liberally in court and would have translated really well to a fighting game moveset. However, Phoenix seemed to be what the development team were stuck on, so they made the decision to include neither character instead of just FRANZISKA. It should be noted that Tatsunoko vs. Capcom's Capcom roster seems to largely stick to using the protagonist or the most iconic character of most of the series represented in-game, and having FRANZISKA but not Phoenix would have flew in the face of that. I get it, but man does it suck. At the least, we got a good ending come Marvel vs. Capcom 3, but it's fun to wonder what if. While we're on the subject of Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, the development team actually published a list of characters on the now-defunct Japanese website for the game that were considered but scrapped for one of 4 described reasons. Copyright issues, which I presume refers to several characters on the Tatsunoko side, licensed characters, again I'm presuming Tatsunoko characters, that were considered too tough to translate to a fighting game, the development team's personal preferences, and overall game balance. There's a few characters on the Capcom side that are interesting here, like Nero from Devil May Cry, Rouge from Power Stone, June from Star Gladiator, big surprise, and the giant Akuma robot from the console ports of Cyberbots, to name a few. The one that always stood out to me the most on this list though, was Leon S. Kennedy from the Resident Evil series. Up to this point in time, the only Resident Evil character in the Versus game had been Jill in Marvel vs. Capcom 2. Leon was still riding the high of Resident Evil 4 at the time, with the acclaimed Wii port of the game actually having released in the vicinity of Tatsunoko vs. Capcom's initial release. I think he could have been a really interesting character to have. We'd later get 3 new Resident Evil characters in Marvel 3 alongside a completely overhauled Jill, so it's not like Resident Evil ended up missing out much in the long run, but outside of Nemesis, most of the Resident Evil content in the series has been centered squarely around Resident Evil 5. I'd like to see that weird alternate timeline where we got some Resident Evil 4 representation. I wonder what his theme song would have been. Though, I guess you can kind of do so if you have the PC version of Marvel 3, since modders have successfully made him a playable character in that game. We've talked about characters so far that were cut at the concept stages of their respective game, but what about a character that actually made it to the development stages? In the lead up to the release of Marvel vs. Capcom 3 in early 2011, producer Ryota made the rounds on the press circuit, doing interviews for the game as well as being a guest on Capcom Unity live streams at trade shows that Capcom happened to be attending. In one such Q&A about 2 months before release, he was asked about characters that were planned or considered but didn't make the cut. He mentioned The Thing being in the running but ultimately passed over because of his similarities to the Hulk, but went on to mention another Fantastic Four character instead, Human Torch. What makes the Human Torch mention so interesting is that apparently the team had him up and running as a functional character in the game during development, but there was an unforeseen technical issue they ran into: console RAM. Being that Human Torch is, well, constantly on fire, the team had animated him as such, but therein lied the issue. His animations would eat up console RAM more than any other character in the game, to the extent that it'd slow the game down, and unfortunately, the development team couldn't find a way to reconcile things without making huge compromises, so he was scrapped. Interestingly enough, this situation is actually what led to another character's inclusion. Having informed Marvel about the issues with Human Torch, Marvel in response floated the idea of Super-Skrull, who has all of the powers of the Fantastic Four, which Capcom agreed to and implemented. Looking at Super-Skrull's moveset, you can definitely see a few attacks that could have originally been conceived for Human Torch, the most obvious of which is his Inferno Hyper Combo, which is a dead ringer for Torch's signature Nova Blast technique in the comics. Even the pose is the same. Last but not least, there's one more piece of cut content for Marvel 3 I want to talk about, and the remnants of this one made it to the final shipped disc. Sort of. Again, in a livestream interview for the game, producer Ryota revealed that there was an additional stage planned that didn't make the cut. A stage based on Capcom's PlayStation 2 classic, Okami. Unfortunately, the development team found that the watercolor and brushstroke aesthetic of the stage clashed with Marvel 3's focus on harsh outlines and Western comic book style shading, so the decision was made to axe it entirely. However, in 2012, a GameSpot forum user by the name of, and I'm pretty sure I'm gonna mangle this, NRC, managed to uncover an unused track from the game's data that 100% sounds like it was meant to be for the scrapped Okami level. In fact, it's the theme you're hearing right now. While it's a shame that they made the decision to axe the stage, I do understand the rationale. But I personally think that contrast would have been really unique and showcased the differences between the Western Marvel aesthetic and the Eastern Capcom aesthetic, in a way that I don't think the series has ever been able to quite capture since that first Marvel vs. Capcom game. But also, I'm not a graphic artist or a video game developer, so I'll trust their word over my personal desires when it comes down to it. And there you have it. That's 6 pieces of cut content for the Versus games. This isn't even scratching the surface of content cut for these games, as there's enough info out there to fill at least 2 or 3 more videos. If you'd like to see more videos along these lines, please do let me know in the comments, and as always, be sure to like, subscribe, follow me on my socials if you're so inclined, and I'll see you next video. Take care.